At 3:08 p.m., Pearl Harbor exploded again. This time, there were no Japanese aircraft overhead. No torpedo wakes crossed the harbor. No battleships were the target. The explosion came from inside an American staging area, in a quiet part of the base called West Loch, where ships were being loaded for one of the most important invasions of the Pacific War. Within seconds, fire was moving across decks crowded with fuel, ammunition, vehicles, and men. Within minutes, ships that had been tied together for efficiency became a single burning structure. By the next day, 6 landing ships had sunk. 163 men were dead. 396 were wounded. And by the official casualty count, Pearl Harbor had experienced its second major wartime disaster, second only to December 7, 1941, by the numbers that survived the Navy's records. But most Americans never learned the story. The official record could count the dead. It could list the ships. It could describe the flames, the wreckage, and the delay to the invasion fleet. What it could not do was prove, beyond doubt, what set off the first explosion. That is the first mystery of West Loch. The second mystery is harder. If no enemy attacked Pearl Harbor that afternoon, why had so many ships been packed with so much fuel and ammunition in one narrow harbor that one accident could become a fleet disaster? West Loch was not the famous site of Pearl Harbor. When people imagine Pearl Harbor, they usually see Battleship Row, Ford Island, and the smoke of December 7, 1941. West Loch sits farther from that memory, a long inlet on the western side of the harbor. During the war, it became a working artery of logistics. Ammunition moved there. Fuel moved there. Landing craft, trucks, weapons, and supplies moved there. If Battleship Row was the remembered Pearl Harbor, West Loch was the working Pearl Harbor, the place where the next invasion was being packed into ships. It was not a stage for ceremony. It was where a war was loaded. In May of 1944, the United States was preparing for Operation Forager, the campaign to seize the Mariana Islands. Saipan was the next major objective. The island mattered because it would bring American forces closer to Japan and open a new phase of the Pacific War. To take it, the Navy and Marines needed landing ships that could carry tanks, vehicles, men, fuel, and ammunition across thousands of miles of ocean. Those ships were called LSTs, landing ship, tank. They were blunt, functional vessels built for invasion. Their bows could open. Their ramps could drop. Their decks could carry machines and cargo directly onto a beach. They were not graceful ships, but they were essential. Without them, an amphibious assault could stall before it touched land. By late May, dozens of vessels were gathered in West Loch. Navy Region Hawaii describes 34 ships there to load ammunition and supplies for Saipan. NOAA records describe 29 LSTs loading in the loch, crowded closely together because space was limited. The shape of the danger was visible before anything exploded. The LSTs were nested together along 6 berths. That meant ships tied close to other ships, sometimes side by side, sometimes in groups so tight that crews had to cross one vessel to reach another. This saved space. It made loading faster. It kept the invasion schedule moving. But it also meant that a fire on one ship did not have to stay on one ship. Around those decks were gasoline drums. Around those drums were ammunition crates. Around the ammunition were vehicles, landing craft, and men still working to prepare for the campaign ahead. Every part of the arrangement made sense if the question was how to launch an invasion on time. Every part became dangerous if the question changed to what happens when one deck explodes. The war had compressed judgment. That is what West Loch shows so clearly. The danger was not hidden in one bad decision. It was distributed across a chain of necessary choices. The Navy needed to move fast. Pearl Harbor had limited working space. The Saipan invasion needed LSTs. LSTs needed cargo. Cargo meant fuel and explosives. Fuel and explosives needed to be loaded before the fleet could sail. Therefore, risk gathered in one place. It gathered in ships tied together. It gathered in drums of high-octane gasoline. It gathered in mortar ammunition being handled near the bow of LCT 963 on or beside LST 353. It gathered under a deadline. On Sunday, May 20th, 1944, much of Pearl Harbor looked routine. Men were loading, checking, waiting, resting, or preparing to leave. The ships in West Loch were part of an enormous military machine. But from a distance, the scene could look like work. Not combat, not battle, work. Among those doing that work were soldiers of the Army's segregated African-American 29th Chemical Decontamination Company, assigned to ammunition loading alongside Navy crews. They were support troops, not combat units. Their assignment placed them at the center of the danger, while the fleet prepared to sail without them. At 3:08 p.m., that illusion ended. The first explosion ripped through LST-353. NOAA places the origin near the bow of LCT-963, where troops from Schofield Barracks were unloading mortar ammunition. LCT-963 was on or beside LST-353 in the crowded nest. What matters for the reconstruction is not a perfectly clean label on one deck, but the dangerous location. Mortar ammunition, a loaded landing ship, and fuel close enough for one explosion to reach the next hazard before anyone could control it. The first blast did not remain a single event. Burning debris fell around gasoline drums. Fires began to spread. Fuel on decks ignited. Men nearby were killed or thrown into the water. Other crews, hearing the explosions from elsewhere in Pearl Harbor, did not immediately know whether this was an accident or another attack. That uncertainty mattered. In a naval base still shaped by the memory of 1941, explosions at Pearl Harbor did not sound harmless. But the enemy was not outside the harbor. The danger was inside the loading plan. At 3:11 p.m., a second explosion followed. At 3:22, a third and even more violent blast tore through the sequence. Fire moved from ship to ship because the ships had been placed close enough for it to move. Some crews tried to fight the fires. Others were forced back by heat and explosions. Forward lines became impossible to reach. Men were pushed toward the sterns of ships, toward the water, toward any route that did not lead into flame. The water itself became part of the trap. Burning fuel spread across the surface. Small craft moved through smoke to rescue men. Tugs and fireboats tried to pull burning ships clear, but towing a ship that is loaded, damaged, burning, and tied into a crowded nest is not a clean operation. It is a fight against weight, lines, wind, heat, and time. Some ships could be moved. Others became drifting hazards. West Loch was narrow enough that one burning ship could threaten more than its own berth. If a vessel broke loose or drifted, it could carry fire toward another group of ships, toward waterfront structures, or toward the ammunition depot itself. The disaster was not just the explosion that had already happened. It was the possibility of the next one. That is the part of West Loch that makes it more than a forgotten accident. The system had no room to fail gracefully. LST-480 was trapped in the crowded berth. It tried to get underway, but the movement of ships and lines around it became part of the problem. It was blocked, fouled, and eventually caught in the fire spreading through the nest. LCT-963 was near the source of the first blast. Other LSTs became involved as flames and debris spread. Over the next hours, West Loch turned into a sequence of fires, explosions, salvage attempts, rescues, and drifting wreckage. The timeline did not move like a single blast in a movie. It moved like a chain. An explosion created fire. The fire reached fuel. The fuel spread heat and flame. The flame reached other ships. The closeness of the ships made movement difficult. The cargo made every minute more dangerous. The men fighting the fire were not only trying to save vessels, they were trying to stop West Loch from becoming a much larger catastrophe. By the end, 6 LSTs had sunk. Several others were badly damaged. Shore buildings were damaged. Fires burned for more than 24 hours. The invasion force lost ships, landing craft, vehicles, guns, fuel, and ammunition, and yet the fleet still sailed. This is one of the strangest facts of the West Loch disaster. The damage was severe, the casualties were real, the wreckage was visible, but the operation it threatened was not stopped. Replacements were found, supplies were shifted, men kept working. The invasion force got underway only one day late, and the assault on Saipan took place on schedule. From a military point of view, that was a logistical achievement. From a human point of view, it also helps explain why the disaster disappeared. The war did not pause to grieve West Loch. It moved past it. There was another reason the story stayed quiet. The disaster happened just before a major operation. Public details could have exposed the scale of the buildup for Saipan, the losses in ships and material, and the vulnerability of a Pacific staging area. Wartime censorship followed. The Navy's inquiry was classified. Public announcements were limited. Survivors and witnesses could not simply turn the disaster into a public story while the war was still being fought. Secrecy did not have to be theatrical to be effective. It only had to be practical. The result was silence. A disaster large enough to rank second at Pearl Harbor by casualties became a footnote because it occurred at the wrong time, in the wrong place, during an operation that could not be delayed. For the families, the silence was not abstract. Some of the dead could not be identified. Some were buried as unknowns. Nearly one-third of the casualties came from the Army's segregated African-American 29th Chemical Decontamination Company, men assigned to support work that placed them directly inside the danger. Their role remained less visible than the ships, the explosions, and the invasion they were helping prepare. That matters, because a disaster is not only measured by what sank, it is measured by who had to stand closest to the risk. The investigation that followed could not deliver the clean answer people usually want from a catastrophe. The Naval Board of Inquiry rejected sabotage. It found no proof of an enemy attack. It examined mortar ammunition, gasoline vapors, safety practices, and the way combat-loaded vessels had been nested together. But the first moment remained partly unreachable because the men nearest to it were among the casualties. That absence shaped the official uncertainty. Investigators linked the first blast to mortar ammunition being handled near LCT 963. But they could not prove whether the fatal moment was a dropped round, ignition of gasoline vapors, careless smoking, welding, or some combination of hazards. Open lights and weak safety discipline were criticized. A single proven trigger was not established beyond doubt. So the most honest answer is not that nobody knows anything. The honest answer is sharper. The record can show the dangerous conditions. It can show the fuel. It can show the ammunition. It can show the ships nested tightly together. It can show the urgency before Saipan. It can show the blast at 3:08 p.m. on LST 353. What it cannot do is return to the exact second before the first detonation and name the spark with certainty. That distinction is important, because if the episode becomes only a mystery about the spark, it becomes smaller than the evidence. West Loch was not made catastrophic by one unknown second. It was made catastrophic by everything waiting around that second. Admiral Chester Nimitz recognized the practical problem. Avoiding the nesting of combat-loaded vessels sounded safer, but Pearl Harbor had facilities the fleet needed. In the logic of war, some risk had to be accepted. That does not make the risk imaginary, it makes it deliberate. The phrase that matters is calculated risk. Calculated risk is not recklessness by itself. Every military operation carries risk, but West Loch shows what happens when a calculation becomes crowded with assumptions. The assumption that loading speed mattered more than separation. The assumption that crews and handlers could manage dangerous cargo in tight quarters. The assumption that a harbor built for war could absorb an accident without multiplying it. At 3:08 p.m., those assumptions were tested at the same time. They failed together. The disaster also sits beside another American wartime explosion, Port Chicago, which came 2 months later in California. That explosion killed hundreds of men during ammunition loading and forced deeper attention to ordnance handling, labor, segregation, and safety. West Loch came first, but it never entered public memory with the same force. It was hidden by operational secrecy, then buried by the forward motion of the war, then softened into a local memorial and a few lines in naval history. Even the physical remains tell the story of partial memory. The wreckage was cleared. The operation continued. But the rusting remains of LST-480 still stand near Waipio Peninsula, one of the few visible reminders that the harbor burned again after 1941. It is not a monument that explains itself. Without the story, it is just metal in the water. With the story, it becomes evidence. Evidence that a protected harbor can become dangerous when urgency overwhelms distance. Evidence that logistics can kill as surely as combat. Evidence that the most important warning signs are sometimes visible to everyone, but accepted because the mission seems larger than the risk. That is why West Loch belongs on the first page of any serious account of Pearl Harbor, not as a rival to December 7th, but as a different kind of disaster. The first Pearl Harbor disaster came from an enemy attack. The second came from an American system under wartime pressure. One was remembered because it began a war. The other was forgotten because the war had to continue. And in that forgetting, the lesson became harder to see. The deeper warning was that fuel, explosives, ships, labor, and deadline had been forced into a geometry where one failure could reach too many others. West Loch was assembled in berths and cargo lists, in the pressure to sail, in the limited space of a harbor, in the confidence that dangerous work could be done quickly because the war required it. The exact spark may never be proven, but the conditions do not need to be guessed. They were there before 3:08 p.m. The ships were already nested. The fuel was already aboard. The ammunition was already being handled. The invasion clock was already running. By the time LST-353 exploded, the disaster had already been given a path. That is the central truth of West Loch. Not that Pearl Harbor was attacked again, not that the Navy hit a simple answer forever, but that America suffered a second Pearl Harbor disaster from a risk it had chosen to accept, then moved so quickly toward victory that the story nearly vanished behind the mission. The West Loch disaster did not begin with the first explosion. It began before the spark, in the decision to pack fuel, ammunition, ships, men, and urgency into the same narrow water. The mystery is what lit the first fire. The lesson is what was already waiting to burn.